All right, and we should be live now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this little CultureCon preview session. We're here at Cask and Ale previewing what we're going to be talking about at CultureCon. I have a few speakers that are going to be joining us here today just to talk about their sessions and culture in general. So I'm excited to talk to you. And I just want to remind everyone that if you are interested in attending CultureCon, be sure to head on over and grab your tickets at cultureconusa.org. The tickets are for July 17th and 18th. You can come here in Madison, or you can even view on the live stream as well. But now I think it's time for us to dive in and hear from our first speaker. We're getting the thumbs up that everybody can hear us, so we're good to go now after a couple of missteps. But Andy, thank you so much for joining me here.
My pleasure, and thanks very much for having me.
So I'm excited to learn just a little bit more about your background, how you got involved in culture and change management and things like that in general, and then want to hear a little bit more about your presentation. But first, let's dive into who you are.
Yeah, sure. So I'm part of the local contingent. I'm a Madisonian. I may not sound much like it, but I've been here over 20 years now. Originally from London, lived in London, Spain, and various other parts of the UK. Came to the US back in, it must have been 1996. And since then, I've been working in a whole variety of different industries. We're fortunate in this area. There are so many different organizations, different types of organization operating out of Madison, from old institutional organizations like insurance that I was in for a while, through biotechnology, through internet startups. And of course, we have companies like Epic Systems, one of the largest software companies in the country, and in fact in the world. So this is a really dynamic area. And what I found myself getting very interested in as an operations manager was the issues we were having in actually trying to change our organizations. And the biggest problems tended to be when we implemented projects and looked for a certain return on them. And they were always a struggle. They were always over budget. They were always late. They never quite delivered on what we thought they were going to deliver on. So I found myself moving from being an operations manager into somebody that was more concerned about how we made effective change happen. So really that's what got me to move into the field of change management. I got exposed to agile software development very early on, about 2004. And the two of them seemed to me to be forces that could really help organizations reposition themselves. The challenges that are still out there are that organizations seem to be trying these things, but very few of them are actually achieving successful transformations. So part of what I want to cover in my session at CultureCon is about that. Why is it so difficult for organizations to actually affect meaningful change? What kinds of things have proved successful? And what are the things that sometimes get in the way of that? And change management itself has an associated set of, I call them myths in my preamble to the session. That may be a little unkind, but they are things that actually get in the way of making change happen. And a lot of it's about how people perceive how humans experience change, and ways to make effective change inside an organizational structure.
Well, maybe that's a good kind of spot to start. So what are some of those myths that can trip people up?
Yeah. Well, I won't go into it now. I'm going to save this for the session.
Sounds good.
The biggest one.
Join the session. Come to CultureCon.
Come to the session. I'm not going to give you the biggest one. The biggest one is the change curve. And that's a soapbox I could stand on all day long. So we will cover that at the session next Thursday. My session is on. But other myths, for instance, are around people, the view that people are somehow inherently resistant to change. A lot of what you see in change literature is about how to overcome resistance, how to make people get on board with what it is you're trying to do. And my view on that, from the experience I've had in some 30 years in business, is that's not a productive way to go about making it happen. There's an old saying that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. The issue really, to me, is about creating an environment where people want to change, where they see the value of that change. Instead of focusing on, there's something wrong with you guys, you need to operate differently, that's a counterproductive approach to it. And so there's a lot of literature out there about how do you overcome employee resistance, how do you overcome people that don't want to get on board. To me, that's coming at the problem from the wrong direction. So I like to explore some of those things that have become enshrined in change management literature and talk about them from a different angle.
Okay.
And a lot of what I'm looking at now is informed by systems thinking. So you look at Deming and others who say if you create the right work environment, you create the right way for the work to flow, you will get better outcomes, and people will get on board with that. And to me, that's a big piece of what Agile is about. It started out as a software development methodology, right, but it has huge application to how people interact and work together. When you think about high bandwidth communication, how people interact effectively as a team, and how you delegate authority to that team to get things done. Those are the kinds of things I'd really like to see organizations doing in terms of trying to affect a culture change. And maybe it's appropriate just to look at why that change is even necessary. I think sometimes we lose sight of that. One of the most influential books I read when I was much younger was Future Shock by Alvin Toffler.
Okay.
And Toffler's kind of dated now, but back in the 70s, he was a futurist. Toffler essentially made the argument that the rate of change was accelerating so much that by the end of the 20th century, people just basically wouldn't be able to cope. And so to support his argument, he looked at, writing was developed 5,000 or so years ago in Mesopotamia. It took about 4,500 years to get effective printing so that you could reproduce the materials. And then gradually the technological advances, satellites, digital communication, those things are built on each other faster and faster.
Yeah.
So this was pre-internet, and he was saying change is going to happen really rapidly.
It's already
now, none of us is freaking out, right? None of us is going mad. I mean, pretty much everybody these days that can afford it has one of these in their back pocket. You can call somebody on the other side of the world. You can live stream from a bar in Madison and reach people all over the world. So part of my argument is people aren't really afraid of change. It's more about how you bring that change to them and how they adapt to it.
If they're excited about it, or if they're feeling like it's forced on them and they're like, yeah.
Yeah, and so the conclusion I came to after looking at a lot of this was it's not the people that you have to force to change, it's the organizations. The people are perfectly adaptable. They deal with change every day in their life. When you put them inside a business organization and then you try to affect change, that's when they start running into boundaries and barriers that the organization itself often puts up, and not necessarily in a way that was deliberate.
Right.
So the example of insurance I talked about, I worked in insurance for 10 years. It wasn't a field I thought I'd see myself in when I was 18. I wanted to be a fighter pilot.
You weren't super excited about going into insurance?
It wasn't my number one list. Apologies to anybody out there that does work in insurance. I came to love it. I wanted to join the Royal Air Force and be a fighter pilot. That was where I was going to go. Changed my mind. But I got into insurance, and what I found as I started to look at it is we were designed to move slowly. We were built to move slowly and not take too much risk. So we have checks, we have barriers, we have boundaries. Now, in insurance, you've got a gap between being completely reckless and being too controlling about what risks you take on. But you're in the risk business. You really, you are taking on risk. That's why you exist. So how do you find that balancing point? And what I ran into was that the organization was working really hard to squeeze out that last few percent of risk from its portfolio. And that was getting in the way of bringing our customers on board.
Of doing new kind of innovative things, of like moving it forward.
Exactly that. And we were barriers to growing our own business. So we were in professional liability insurance. Most people will know that as medical malpractice. We insured doctors, we insured hospitals. And our application form for doctors ran to almost 20 pages.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So who's going to fill out a 20-page app? And you're a busy doctor. You've got, you're wherever you're working. And our agents were calling me saying, we don't have time to do this. Why is this necessary? So one of the early things I did was go to the underwriters and say, why are we asking all these questions? What questions do we actually need to have answered in order to underwrite a risk? Let's just ask those, because we're getting in the way of ourselves. So after a collaboration, we got ourselves down to about 4 pages. We were able to cut out an awful lot of stuff that we were asking to be super careful, but it was getting in the way of our business growth. And there was it was finding that balancing point between asking enough questions to be comfortable with the risk, not so many that we drove the risk away. So that was one example of just an organization creating a barrier for itself by being ultra careful, ultra slow to respond to what the marketplace wanted.
Well, and that's one example, but I'm sure that happens in every single organization all the time in so many different layers, where they just put up all of these extra little barriers, these things that don't allow them to adapt as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. Another good example would be in any organizational control that is designed to second guess somebody's decision. And this is one of the big things for me, is that the way for organizations to be more adaptive, to deal with that fast changing world that Toffler described and others have described since, to deal with that is to make your organization responsive to the environment. Mm-hmm. And so you build something, your customer gives you feedback, it wasn't what we wanted, you build something else. Most of the organizations around now that have grown up in the 20th century were designed to be incrementally improved and to have checks and controls. So I can't make the decision, I have to send it up to somebody else to make that decision. Whereas in order to, by the time you've got there, the environment's moved on.
It's
things have changed. So you look at product development, you look at any aspect of what a business is doing. Those are real challenges. What's interesting is that this isn't new thinking. There's nothing new in this. And it goes all the way back to Deming and probably goes all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. One of them said there is no new thing under the sun, right? So none of this is new. What intrigues me is why is it taking organizations so long to do something about it?
To make those changes.
To make those changes. So it implies it's inherently difficult.
So as somebody who's in an organization who's out there and they want to make their organization more adaptive to be able to handle some of this change, like what should they be thinking about? What are some of those questions maybe they should be asking themselves? Yeah,
that's a really good question. There's probably half a dozen different ways to get to that answer. I think you need to understand your own organization, the business you're in. Like, so if you're in an electrical utility, you're in a very different world from somebody in a web startup. Yeah. So where do you want to be adaptable? Where do you need to be adaptable to serve your marketplace? If you're a utility, you've got miles and miles of infrastructure that you have to maintain that's physical. Mm-hmm. If you're online, you don't have that so much and you're able to respond very quickly to what your customers are looking for. But in any case, you've got to look at where is it you need to be adaptive. You don't necessarily have to be adaptive everywhere. If you're an insurance company, you are highly regulated. Every state has its own regulations. So you may not be able to get much traction there. But where is it you can go and break the mold and do something that's really going to put you in fast touch with your customers? And then when you know that, you've got to find a way to build that into your structure. And that's I'm not giving away anything too much by saying one of my main arguments is that to change the culture, you have to start with the structure. Okay. And a good example would be you walk around companies and there's usually an HR-driven initiative that says, take more risks or fast fail or try stuff out, whatever it is. The problem is nobody has any incentive to change their behavior because they're still in the same structure, they're rewarded the same way, their managers behave the same way. Why would I go out and do that?
If you take that risk, you're still going to be the one who's called out for it.
So that to me is you start with the environment, you start with who is your customer, where do you need to be adaptive, and then you have to figure out how to build that into your structure. And I won't pretend that's easy. For long-lived organizations, it's really difficult. It's got to start at the bottom and at the top, but the empowerment only comes from management who are able to enable their employees to act in a different way. And it might be something like you look at an airline that empowers their front desk people to make concessions for passengers who are in distress or have problems. Instead of picking up the phone and calling a supervisor and then calling someone else, they can make a decision right there. Yeah. The customer's happy. It's a great response. And that's not a new model. So how do we get to that in every organization? Because if we don't get to that, we're going to find ourselves out of business. I truly believe there are businesses who aren't going to get there fast enough, and competition's going to take their business away.
Well, yeah, I mean, that makes complete sense because, things are changing so rapidly. Like the speed of change is increasing. So the business, the organizations as a whole need to be more adaptive. Yeah. They need to be more willing to get to the ground level and change with the opportunities.
Yeah. Well, and we used to have an old-fashioned thing called barriers to entry, right? Yeah, used to be you're in a business and you had barriers to entry. These days we have far fewer barriers to entry because of the technological advances largely. And, examples of that might be if you wanted to run a taxi service in New York, you had to have a medallion. Yeah. And the medallion cost you a small fortune because they were limited in number and they were very prized. We now have competition from at least 2 ride-sharing services. And whatever you think about how those organizations are run and the character of the people that run them, and there's been some controversy about that, whatever you think of that, they found a different way to supply that service. And they said, we're not a taxi service, we're a ride-sharing service.
They took the barriers of entry and just eliminated them almost completely.
They just ignored it. And that was made possible because we have Google Maps, we have apps, we have cell phones.
We have great signal almost everywhere.
Great signal almost everywhere. So you can do that stuff that you couldn't do. The taxi companies didn't see it coming. A similar example in England was the print workers. And I was there in 86, I think it was 85, 86, when the first digital printing presses were set up. And the print workers were put out of business almost overnight. And again, there were political implications to that. It was about the Print Workers Union and Rupert Murdoch. So there's a whole other layer to that. But underlying it is that a new technology had arrived and it completely eliminated the need for a certain role. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for organizations is what do you do with people? Yeah. If you're a company that has an ethical position on that and you care about the workers you have, how do you make that transition happen in a thoughtful way and not end up with a sudden overnight transformation that puts those people out of work or doesn't give them time to find another role for themselves to do? So to me, it's the issue in business for the 21st century is how do you become an adaptive organization? How do you develop a culture of adaptability in your organization? And how do you do it with people who've grown up in a command and control environment, right? That's been what they know. They got to the top because that's what worked for them.
They were good in that structure.
They were really good in that structure. I have a quote about that. It's a command and control. It worked for me, but it's not the future. Yeah. And that was Lou Gerstein at IBM. And it was back in the late 90s. And he was looking at business going, we can't keep going like this. And the issue is how clearly is that seen and how invested is management in actually making that change happen? And again, if you don't, I think there's an on-ramp for that. And if you don't make those changes early enough, you're going to find yourself without enough time to make those changes. So bringing that back to what I will be covering in my session, I want to look at what are the change myths that inhibit people from making effective change? What are the things that you can do to actually practically start implementing change in your organization? And what does that mean for how organizational cultures develop in the future? And this is a participatory discussion, so everybody that comes, I'm looking for your stories. So if you're watching this and you come to my session, 1 o'clock on Thursday, I'm going to be setting up the discussion. I'll be presenting a short audio visual that talks about these kinds of challenges. It's 20 thoughts about change in 600 seconds. And then I'm looking for participation in what have you seen? What kinds of things have been going on? What's worked in organizations that you've been in to bring meaningful change that then affects not only the culture of the organization, but how that organization works with its customer base? Because that's who we're there to serve at the end of the day. So please come along if you're going to be there tomorrow. Tomorrow? Where am I going?
Not
if you're going to be
tomorrow.
there next Wednesday or Thursday, be wonderful to see you there.
And just a reminder too, if you can't make it to Madison, then we do have live stream tickets. We're going to be live streaming a lot of the main sessions. So you can get those tickets and you can find out all of that information by heading to cultureconusa.org. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining me here for a little while. I think we're going to bring you back later, but we have another speaker here, so I want to quick talk to them, and I think we're going to have a little panel discussion with all the speakers that come here today. So thanks again.
Yeah, excellent. Thank
you. See you in a
little bit. All right.
Yeah. So we're just kind of making a little transition here, and again, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this live stream. We have our next speaker in the building. And again, just be sure to check out the tickets here and join us if you can. If you can make it live, awesome. Otherwise, we do have the live stream tickets. Well, Jennifer, come on in. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I'm going to hand you the mic.
All right.
And yeah, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you. And why don't you just give everyone a little bit of a background on who you are and how you relate to culture and CultureCon.
Sure. So my name is Jennifer Pulvermacher, and my background is in organizational change. I've been working as a change specialist my entire career. I'm also a yoga therapist and a mindfulness teacher. I came to mindfulness practice and started offering it in company workplace settings about 5 years ago. And I'm super passionate about bringing more mindfulness practices to the workplace because I think our leaders in particular really need to focus on being present. And that's what my talk will be about at CultureCon on Wednesday.
Nice. No,
Yeah.
I love that. That'll be great. How does being present, how is that really impacting these organizations and these companies? Like, in your talk, what are some of the key things you want to highlight?
So the title of my talk is The Power of Pause. So creating resilience amidst constant change, right? So I think so many of us, we constantly hear about being more agile. Everybody wants to be agile. But how do we do that when we're constantly moving from one thing to the next, right? We're never really present for what's in front of us. In fact, there was a study done by some Harvard researchers in 2010 that showed that almost half of the time, the average adult's attention is focused not in the present, but someplace else. So for me, when I feel like we're moving so quickly and everyone else wants to be more agile, more flexible, if you don't know where you are in the moment, how can you be agile? How can you change, right? So that's really what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, to be adaptive, you need to actually be present and know what to adapt to quickly. Like that makes a lot of sense to me. Like it really is about being in that moment in order to see where the opportunities are.
Right. And so often we go through our days focusing on what's next. So our minds like to travel, time travel. They like to time travel to the past and to the future. And I'm sure many people who are listening today can relate to the meeting that they've attended where nobody in the room was really in the meeting. They were physically sitting around the table, but they weren't in the meeting. And so that's what mindfulness practice can teach. And there's so many studies that have been done now recently around these practices and how they impact our brains, how they impact our focus and attention. So the research is now there to back it up. And that's what's really exciting.
Oh, that's really cool. I love that. So yeah, I'm just kind of definitely getting interested in mindfulness just in general too, and just the way it can impact your performance as an individual. But I love the idea of thinking about how can having mindful and present employees impact the entire organization. Like what can that do to the organization like that? I think that's really neat.
Right. I think people are, overstressed. They're overwhelmed by the amount of work that they need to do. And so there's this myth that we don't have time to pause. We don't have time to take a break. We have to just keep going from the next to the next. And that's why I wanted to do this talk called The Power of Pause, because I think it's somewhat counterintuitive. We tend to think, oh, I don't have time to stop, to take a break. There's too much to get done. Right. But ironically, by taking that time out to pause and reset or reboot our nervous system, to get out of our heads a little bit and back into our bodies and to establish that presence, we can show up for what's next a little bit more ready to go. Right. Yeah. And in fact, by taking those short pauses and breaks throughout our days and weeks, we can actually accomplish more. So I've experienced this in my own personal life. I have a daily meditation practice. And I feel that now my body is starting to crave that idea, that time of just sitting still, right? And it allows time for more creative thoughts to occur, to just arise. I feel like I can get into the flow a little bit more versus that anxious feeling of I have so much to do and I don't know where to start, right?
Or in just like doing the ping pong thing where you're bouncing from one thing to the next. Like even as you're mentioning this, I can think. I've noticed it a little bit even in my own life. Like I do a lot of video editing, constantly working on that kind of thing. But if I do a like hour-long session and then take even like a 5-minute break just to walk around a little bit, to go for a quick little lap, coming back, I'm able to be so much more focused, so much more productive than if I just tried to power through and keep going.
Right. All of this multitasking that we do where we think we're getting more done. I mean, there's studies that have been done that show that that's a myth, right? It actually takes the brain more time to recover when we go back and forth. We're just switching, like processing, switching back and forth, back and forth. It burns more energy.
I would say we're not good at. Like
no, we're not good at it.
We can't parallel process at all.
We can't parallel process. I mean, you can do it for a while, but it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Right. And so in order to be able to respond to change that's coming so quickly from all different directions with a team of people that's overstressed, overworked, we need to be able to create cultures that allow those pauses, right? That encourage people to take those breaks, whether it's a 5-minute break, twice in a day, or maybe it's a 3-day retreat, taking some time off to volunteer or focus on your passions, whatever they are. And I think we as leaders can create those types of cultures that allow that, because in the past that hasn't been the case. The thought has been more like, you got to get done. There's no time for breaks.
Yeah, I want to dive into that a little bit more. So as leaders in organizations, or even middle managers, or people running their own startups, how do you start to build this? Like, it seems counterintuitive, or it doesn't seem like appropriate to go and say, we're mandating your presence, you're
Right.
meditating. Like, that's not going to be effective.
No.
So how does an organization go through and kind of build that in?
Yes. And so it has to be an opt-in type program, right? It has to be built organically. And just to give you an example, I worked with an engineering firm locally, and they wanted to create a mindfulness program for their engineers. And engineers, as we all know, very left brain analytical, right? The last thing you want to do is introduce something that sounds all foofy, right?
All woo-woo.
Soft stuff, right? And so what we did with this group in particular is we led with the science. So we started off by sharing some of the research that's been done, the impact that it has on stress levels, the impact that it has on productivity, taking this time for mindfulness, how it changes the brain. We teach them about neuroplasticity and how that works. Shared some of the research that right from here at Center for Healthy Minds, and then we kind of got them interested and got them piqued, and started with small little practices so that they could get a flavor for what it was like and experience it in their bodies, right? Then when we would set up, let's just say a 30-minute, practice session, it's whoever wants to come can come. It definitely is not mandated, but the idea being play around with different practices, see what works for you, observe what you notice shifts in terms of your energy level, your productivity, your mind, right? How focused you can be. And then I think people just start to see the benefits, and then they want more.
I like that. I like that a lot. So would you change your approach if you're going to a different organization? Like, are you constantly kind of suggesting that organizations tailor their approach based off of the general temperament of their employees?
Yes, it's helpful to know upfront if an organization wants to bring mindfulness in as part of their overall culture, overall change practice. I would first start by understanding what are their objectives. What's bringing them in? Is it the stress levels are really high and they think this is going to be a silver bullet that fixes it, or are employees asking for it? What's the case for change? Why are they looking to bring that in? And then also get an understanding for the business in general, what's happening. And then that helps me to determine like what's the best approach for this particular group. If it's coming from HR and it's viewed as an HR program, it's not going to get the reception.
It's not going to have the buy-in.
No. So if you're working with, classic example is Aetna insurance company. Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, was a real strong believer in mindfulness and yoga because both of those practices helped him heal from a very painful ski accident. And so he was already, as the leader of the company, was already seeing the benefits in himself personally. He was aware of the data and the research that had been done. And so, it's really important to get the leaders on board if you want to implement this type of program in order for it to really take effect. It's just like change 101, right? It has to have leadership support and sponsorship, or
they can't just talk about it either. Like, they have to actually show that we're willing to give you time to do this. We're willing to give you space to do this. We're willing to bring in people to train you to do this. We're not just going to talk about wellness. We're actually going to put some stuff in behind that.
Right. So I think a really key component is developing self-awareness for leaders so that leaders have the ability to be more aware of how they are in the present moment. Are they present in the meeting? Are they showing up for a performance review and they're present?
Yeah, if they're the leader on their phone.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because if they can't model that behavior, then, what's the point of trying to introduce it to anyone else?
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So is there anything else specifically around your talk that you want to kind of tease to people to kind of let them know that they should definitely come check it out?
Yeah. So I've been doing some teasers on LinkedIn. I've got some little mindfulness snacks on LinkedIn. So if anybody wants to give those a try, I've recorded 2 of them, just short little video practices. And I would say show up with a willingness to practice and play around a little bit. Whether you have an existing mindfulness practice or not, this session will be tailored for you. You'll get something out of it. It's not just going to be a talk. We're going to play, we're going to practice, we're going to experiment a little bit. And I'm excited to get people's input into terms of their own personal experience with these practices.
And I love that it's going to be very interactive.
Yeah.
It's going to be a chance for people to apply things and to kind of start testing it out. Like, I think those make some of the best sessions.
Yes.
So, like, that'll be awesome.
Yes, and there definitely will be a takeaway, some specific tips and practices that people can start working with right away.
Nice.
So, yeah.
When's your session again?
Wednesday morning at 10:15.
Nice. I'm glad you knew it.
Yes, and we are doing a mindfulness practice session on Thursday morning at 7:30
nice.
a.m. I believe it's at 7:30, 45-minute session. So for those who are spending the night and want to take advantage of a little bit longer on-site practice at the Concourse Hotel. So
nice.
That
That's awesome.
too.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That'll be fun. I'll definitely have to make sure to find time to sneak into some of those.
Yeah.
Like, that'll be great. So I just want to remind, we're going to swap out speakers again. We have
Sounds
one more
good.
speaker coming on that we'll talk to and just kind of go through and talk about their session. But just kind of remind people that you can still get your tickets for CultureCon. Just head on over to CultureCon USA, cultureconusa.org. You can find your tickets there for there's still tickets for the live event if you're in Madison, the 17th and 18th. Or if you want to check out the live stream, you can do that. And like we mentioned, we are here at Cask and Ale, which is they're hosting our VIP party. So now we're gonna bring on in our third speaker. So come on in. Thanks for joining me, Ted.
Absolutely. How you doing?
Excellent. How are you doing?
Good.
Nice to see you. I'm gonna hand you the mic,
Okay.
and we're just gonna have a little chat and kind of talk about your life and talk about culture and how it's affected you. So I guess to kind of kick things off, tell me a little bit, tell everyone a little bit about your background and how you kind of got interested in culture in general.
Yeah, for sure. Is this the right distance? How?
That's about perfect.
Okay,
I'll make
cool.
a little adjustments if I need to.
Cool. Sounds good. So, background. Yeah. So Madison native. So it's really fun
Nice.
to be doing this here in Madison.
In the hometown.
Went to UW. Took the standard path to entrepreneurship, which is being a Spanish and Latin American studies major.
Nice. I like that.
So I've been kind of all over the place, pretty diverse career experience. I was an interpreter and a translator. I was a Spanish teacher, and I worked at Epic. Sort of a long story short, I suppose, through the transition from Epic to grad school, I wanted to be a psychotherapist. I was going back for counseling psychology. I was brainstorming with a friend of mine about business ideas, and we really wanted to start a company that I think what excited us most was not having a boss. That sounded cool.
That always sounds nice.
Yes. And also just having a company that was different than some of what we had experienced, having a company where people really felt like they can be themselves, where there wasn't sort of like putting on a persona once you walk in in the door. I think having worked at enough places where you get there's enough of a vibe, or there's kind of a consistent
standard
consistent
operating,
sense of like, oh, it's Monday, and like kind of a working for the weekend kind of.
Yeah.
Like there has to be a better way to do this. So that was kind of our excitement that was our inspiration for starting something. So we wanted to start Blue Tree, and I can get more into that to whatever extent you want to, but that was intended to be, we called it the Match.com, which is now so not cool. Match.com's terrible. Having used it years ago, I can attest to that. But anyway, we called it the Match.com for healthcare IT consulting, and we were intending to be kind of a direct connection platform for healthcare experts, Epic experts, to connect with health systems, thinking that would create more transparency, more efficiency. And basically what we found was that was too big a leap for the industry, too big a leap for the market. But so in sort of failing in that, it was actually a great success because it got enough people noticing us and saying, hey, those guys are trying to do something new, do something different, that we got incredible people, such as our CEO, Jeremy Schwach, who's still there today running the show. We got amazing talent on board and became more of a traditional consulting company, but still very innovative, still very focused on
pushing the
culture and everything like that. So that's kind of the history of Blue Tree and a little bit of my background.
Nice. I like that. So when we're talking specifically about your presentation at CultureCon, what are you going to be discussing, talking about there?
Yeah. So my presentation, so I transitioned about 3 years ago out of the day-to-day of Blue Tree to life coaching,
Okay.
so personal development coaching. So I wanted to get back to sort of what I was doing in grad school, counseling psychology, and working with people on optimal living. How do you get the most out of this time we have on the planet? So connecting that back to your question, I'm co-presenting with Caleb Campbell. He's the chief of staff at Blue Tree, a phenomenal human.
Nice.
And it's really a call to action to say, it's easy to sit back and say, yeah, if only my CEO implemented this perfect policy or was a different person, or a CEO to say, if only my employees, could do this right. And the message is really one of personal responsibility. It's no matter where you are, no matter if it's your first day on the job, no matter if you've been with the company 30 years, there's so much you can do now and now and now and now to positively impact culture, create a better experience for yourself and for everybody around you. So that's the essence of what we're going to be talking about.
No, I really like that, because I do think it's important to think about how can we empower that individual person to make some of these changes. And I actually really love the three people we've had here today, because you're talking very specifically about the individual and how they can impact culture. We had Jennifer talking a lot about just how being present can help, impact culture in general. And then Andy was talking a lot about just how to create system change and change
Totally.
in the system and in the structure. So it's coming at it from several different angles, but ultimately they're all trying to do the same thing, which is create this amazing place to work.
Exactly. Yeah, it's super important to have all those components. You do need that leadership level of modeling at the leadership level, creating structure, creating process that supports strong culture, and every individual has to step up.
Yeah. Well, and let's dive into that just a little bit. If you're talking to an employee, somebody who is out there working for a bigger organization, let's say in healthcare, maybe even, like a doctor or a nurse, somebody along those lines, how can they start to impact and change the culture of their organization?
Well, I don't want to give away too much of my presentation, but let me just say that
Just the highlights.
yes, I would say that at risk of sounding cliche, so much is perspective. So much is the thoughts you're having, the feelings, the emotions you're having, how you relate to those experiences, and the action you take. And far too often, whether it's at the workplace or elsewhere, we get stuck in automatic pilot in believing thoughts we have about a situation or about what another person thinks of us. And so there's that kind of automatic pilot default mode that we can get into, that in the workplace, when you aggregate that and everybody spends the majority or a significant part of their time just reacting to their environment instead of consciously saying, okay, I don't need to believe that thought. Okay, I don't need to avoid that challenging emotion, that anxiety of presenting or of telling somebody what I really think about an idea. And so that change at the individual level creates room to take action that's aligned with what's really important to you, with what is meaningful to you. And if everybody's acting in a way that is fulfilling to them and not kind of driven by their automatic thoughts or their unquestioned thoughts or their desire to not feel things that are uncomfortable, it completely transforms culture. So
Yeah.
that's
So it's a little bit about really leaning into that uncomfortableness and
Totally.
having those difficult conversations and things like that when they need to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you hear a lot now about vulnerability, about leaning into what's uncomfortable, and there's a good reason for that. I mean, it's really true. Yeah, that's where change comes from. That's where growth comes from.
Nice. I like that. I like that a lot. So what do you see as, I guess, when we're talking culture in organizations, what do you see as kind of that big opportunity? Where are some of those new things that are happening here?
Yeah, well, I do think I don't know specifically what Jennifer is going to be getting into, but that's going to be a really good one, I think, because mindfulness, again, it's something that has become talked about a lot, and I think it's often probably misunderstood or over talked about or implemented in a superficial way. But that idea of really being self-aware, to me, and this is kind of my perspective and my bias, that ultimately, it's great. We do need the people who are more at the system level, saying, okay, this is the structure we need in place. This is the technology we need in place to support communication, things like that. But to me, what's going to change, make the biggest impact in our society and in companies is giving people the tools to grow on their own, to understand how to look at themselves more deeply, more critically, and grow so that they are with each day bringing more of their best selves. So I think really mindfulness and practices like that are a form of technology. It's a different kind of technology, but bringing those kinds of tools and practices into the workplace and fine tuning them and adjusting them in a way that they're really accessible. And people who, I think a lot of times people who have mindfulness, they roll their eyes, they say that's like woo woo cheesy or something like that. Yeah. But it's actually great stuff. It's just finding a way to connect those kinds of principles with what resonates with the average person.
Nice. I like that. I like that a lot. Well, Ted, I want to thank you for being here and thank you for kind of talking through some of this, talking a little bit about your session. So we're going to bring the other two speakers back and do a little bit of a panel discussion here in a second, but anything else around your actual presentation that you want to kind of highlight or mention?
No, I would just say, if you're there for it, don't be on your phone because I'm going to call you out.
Be present. Be
present. I think we're going to try to be funny. And if we're not, I'd appreciate laughter anyway.
The awkward laugh will at least be nice.
Any kind is totally fine. So, yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, again, as we kind of get ready to bring the other panelists back on, I just want to remind you that there are still tickets available for CultureCon. It is happening July 17th and 18th. You can head on over to cultureconusa.org where you can get tickets to attend here live, or we are offering live stream tickets. So if you can't make it to Madison, you can grab those. And just another shout out to Cask and Ale. That's where we are here right now. They are doing the after party, the VIP party. So there's still tickets available for that as well. But with that, let's grab Jennifer and Andy. Come on over. We're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion here. I just want to kind of talk to the three of you a little bit about culture. We will have to kind of pass the mic back and forth as we kind of go through that. But I guess just to start it off, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing organizations when it comes to creating culture? Like, what do you see as kind of that big piece, that big hiccup for them?
We're all going to be polite to somebody.
Yeah.
Like where to start? I think it depends on the history of the organization. Like if the organization has grown, organically, it's much easier, I think, to create the type of culture that the organization wants, the leaders want, versus if there's been some merger and acquisition activity, it's much more difficult because now you're dealing with potentially two different types of cultures coming together, which doesn't always work. So I think it kind of depends on where the organization's at and how it's come to be where it is right now.
Yeah, there are so many different things here, I think, but one that I really think about is what are the forces that prevent the organization taking seriously the need to change? So if you're in an area where you continue to make money, you've got a large fund sitting behind you, and insurance is a good example. Utilities is another example. Areas that have still some barriers to entry that are difficult to overcome. There isn't as much obvious pressure to make the change happen. So it's easy to go, yeah, we're gonna become more agile, and play around the edges, but actually not really do any fundamental change. That's one of the ones I see quite frequently.
Just kind of give it a lot of voice, but not really put anything into action.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say they're not taking any action at all, but the actions they're taking are not making fundamental transformations. And there's a difference between making changes that will implement a new software system that will make us cutting edge, but then not actually doing anything about how the organization is structured and how it makes decisions and how it uses that software. So that would be kind of the example I would look at.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I would add that a lot of culture is not easily quantifiable or easily tracked, and with a focus on the bottom line, which organizations need to have to at least a significant extent. It can be easy to say, I'm not going to invest X $1,000 in this soft side of things. And I think that's one of the hardest things for leaders to overcome, to say, actually, we do need to spend several $1,000s on improving communication and learning how to be more present or more vulnerable. And I think that's making that case is harder, because I think after it's done, companies say, wow, we're completely different than we were before. But going into it, they say, well, what's the ROI?
Yeah, how do we see that return? So what's the best way for an employee to kind of make some of that case? Like, how do you start as someone who is maybe middle management or even kind of that frontline employee? How can you start to implement some of those changes or make those changes happen in your culture?
That's a big question.
It's a really big question.
So we're
about the big questions.
You are about the big questions today. Wow. That is a difficult one to answer, because I think there's only so much you can do from where you are in the organization. For middle manager, and I've been a middle manager most of my career, so I've been in that position. It's what's within your sphere of influence. What can you do with your own team that makes a difference? How do you lead and how do you demonstrate the qualities that you think are important as a manager? It's much harder for you to make systemic change and to do things. I mean, that really tends to come driven by HR or by a VP that has the ability to push those programs out. I think at the individual level, we can all apply what we're learning and what we experience as a best practice for helping motivate people and create that culture in our own teams. Sometimes you have constraints because of the business you're in, but to me, there's the individual piece that you have influence over, and maybe you can influence some of your peer group, and maybe you can influence some of the people that are at a more senior level. But I think it's hard without that systemic support to try to make the change. I'm curious what you guys think about this.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think there are some things you can do, like you said, with your own team. Maybe something as simple as the way that you run meetings, or maybe you don't stick with the standard. We're going to do a 60-minute meeting and then do back-to-back meetings. We're going to do 50-minute meetings and give people a chance to transition from one to the next. I think you can set a real strong direction in terms of what you value amongst your team and reinforce that behavior within your team. But yeah, to change it systematically throughout the organization, your hands are tied unless you've got your leader on board.
Yeah, just echoing what you guys are saying. I think it's as humans, we often focus on what's beyond our sphere of influence and scope of control, and that usually just creates more suffering for ourselves and those around us. So I think, if someone were watching this as a middle manager and saying, I think if you come with the approach of how can I change? I have a 10-person team and a 3,000-person company. It's a really kind of defeatist, negative attitude that's probably going to make you unmotivated. But I think if you say, to your points, what's a little experiment I can run within my group, and run that, collect some data, and I think I go with the minimum viable product type of approach. What's something small that you can measure? Qualitative assessment before and after of how engaged people are, how happy people are at work, whatever the thing is, and just run those experiments. You're creating something positive in the organization, and trust that people will eventually notice. And if they don't, you're still already doing something awesome.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the more that you can get your team involved in deciding what those things are that you're gonna experiment with, those little pieces that you're gonna try and get their input on that, the better, right? Because then they'll want to do it. They'll be on board.
Yeah, it'll be adding to that buy-in that we've kind of been talking a lot about today. Like I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So what do you see in terms of opportunities here? Like let's just kind of, I know we've been talking a lot about culture, why it's important, but like we haven't really dove into like the actual why component. What are some of the future things? What can it lead to? Why is this such a big deal for us to be having an entire event around?
Well, I would say that increasingly there's an interest when people think about work in finding fulfillment, not just working for the weekend, working for the paycheck, paying the bills, that kind of thing. So ultimately, I think the companies are going to be left behind if they're not focused on culture. It's a must-have to think about, are my employees fulfilled? Are they fully expressed at work? Are they engaged? Because if you don't, you're just not going to succeed. That's my perspective.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think part of it is that there's more of a wave of this occurring now. I think for a long time, organizations were relatively static in what they expected from employees and how they treated employees. The outside pressures that are coming now make it more necessary to change. You're going to have to move. You're going to have to get on board. I mean, I'm one of those people who's closer to the end of my career than I am to the beginning of it. But there's a generational shift coming, which I think brings with it change and different expectations of what we should be doing in the workplace, even down to how we work. At one organization I worked at, a new hire came in, who was in his 20s, was shown to his cube, And he looked at the desk phone and pointed at it and said, well, what's that for? Why do we have those? It's like, really? You're still buying desk phones? Come on. So I think some of it's incremental. Every little piece, the pressure that's out there to move in a different direction and do things differently starts to make that change. And I think cumulatively, that there's the business necessity to make it happen, but there's also the kinds of things we're discussing here about new generations of workers that are coming through. Yeah.
Nice. I like that. So we talked just briefly about what like middle manager, kind of that front of the line person can do. But what if you are the person in charge? Like, what if you're at that executive level? You're the owner of the business. What are some of the first things you should be thinking about in terms of implementing some of these cultural change and moving to the culture that you want to have?
That's a big. So you really are hitting the big stuff here. There are many places to go with that, I think. One of the things that occurs to me is understand where you're at. As an executive, you get to that level because of the skills you have. You get there because of your ability to make decisions and influence the organization. Part of it is, why aren't you doing this stuff already? So examine that. Why is it? Maybe it's not something you're comfortable with. Maybe it's not something you've done. Maybe you don't see the necessity, but start by asking the question, what could I be doing differently? And if I was to pick out one thing to start with, it's what are you role modeling? What are you doing? Every day people come in and they see you across the room and they'll draw conclusions, whether you like it or not, about how you're doing, what's going on. They draw conclusions from how you present meetings, things that you say. Think about what example you're setting. And as an example here in town, the CEO of American Family Insurance wrote on his blog that he started doing Gemba walks. And so I'm not sure they're actually really strictly speaking Gemba walks, but the point is he's going out into the business and asking questions of employees and listening to employees and getting himself a direct feedback loop with people in the organization that's not filtered through other layers of the organization. So it's like a skip level or something else, but it's done more informally. It's not come to meet with me and we'll sit and have coffee. It's I'm going to come out to where you're working and I'm going to listen to what you have to say. There's a great practical thing anybody could do tomorrow if they're in a leadership position. There are much bigger things you could do, but I think.
Well, and I think that's a great way to get that started. Exactly like you're saying. Like that's a great way to kind of kickstart that change. It'll help you realize these are the areas that we need to focus on. This is maybe top priority versus some of the other things in the culture.
Yeah, make some time for that. What else? What else you guys?
I think something that you said is really important, and that is as a leader, as an executive, is taking the time to listen. First off, listen to yourself. What are your objectives? What are your values? What are you really trying to accomplish with this business? And then listening to your people. It's one thing to ask or to do an employee engagement survey, but to then do nothing with the results or to really not listen and follow through. People pick up on that. And then culture tends to be viewed as, it's just lip service. So I think you have to really take the time to listen and then be crystal clear about defining what is it? What are the elements of the culture that we want to see happening here along maybe a variety of dimensions, and then getting employees involved to define those.
Nice.
Yeah, making it happen.
I like that.
I'm going to bring my coaching bias into this and say that, to the extent that a leader hasn't done their own personal work, they're going to limit their potential as a leader. And there's a really amazing executive coach out there who says something along the lines of, to the extent that a leader is unaware of his or her shadow, that's going to be reflected in the culture. And so shadow being kind of the parts of yourself, you don't want to see the darker sides that you're unaware of. So for example, if you have a leader who's terrified of failure, terrified of making a mistake, or doesn't want to look stupid in front of their colleagues or say the wrong thing, that's a kind of reflector or culture that's going to be permeated through the organization. So I think it's critical for leaders to find an amazing coach. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not really kidding. It's so funny you ask. But no, I think whether as a leadership team or individually, to really look at themselves, that's going to open up a lot of potential to grow as a leader and improve the culture.
Nice. I like that a lot. So as I want to ask you all, why should people come to CultureCon?
Oh man, it's a great event. I mean, last year was the first event, and I had such a great experience. I felt people were engaged. There was good conversation. It wasn't just going from one breakout session to the next. I don't know what your experience was, you guys that were there, but I feel that people, it's about time we're having this conversation. It seems like we've been saying culture is important, it's important, but nobody's really getting the message. And to sit and see a group of leaders around a table discussing it as a strategic priority is pretty exciting. So I think, and we've got a great speaker lineup. So I say, get your ticket now if you haven't already.
You can grab you can grab your ticket. It's on the screen. Grab it. It's in the description. Be there.
Yeah, so I think we really hit on the importance of culture. And I think one of the great things about CultureCon is it hits it from all these diverse angles. There's the change management component. There's a leadership alignment component. There's the kind of coaching perspective. There's a kind of personal empowerment, no matter where you are in the organization, kind of workshops. So it's whatever kind of all those different aspects of culture. I think the last year and looking at the lineup again, certainly this year, does a great job balancing. Like you're going to get a lot out of it. There's a lot that can be applied right when you get back to work.
When really wherever you are in the organization, whatever kind of organization you're in, you're going to be able to have these takeaways. Like I do really like that part too.
Right, and it was like there's so many conferences that it's easy to go to a conference that you're excited about. And it's like, okay, that was interesting. How do I take action on it? And what I like about this is it's really actionable. That's been my experience.
Yeah. I'd add one last thing, which is about the energy. You get a lot of energy from the people, and when you're working trying to affect change, and you actually want to influence a culture, it can get pretty depressing sometimes when you're beating your head against something that feels like you're the only one that cares about it, or you're the only one that really wants to make that change. And if you are that middle manager who's trying to influence your area, this is an opportunity to come and speak with and hear from like-minded people who want to make change happen and really influence the culture. So as Nick said, get your tickets. Still a few on sale. Come down. You'll have a great time. We'll all look forward to chatting with you.
Well, I think we said it a bunch. You should grab your tickets and head on down to CultureCon. We still have spots available if you want to be here live. You can make it to Madison July 17th and 18th. Head on down. Otherwise, we also do have a live streaming ticket available if you're anywhere else or just can't get to Madison or can't get the day off for whatever reason. You can get the live streaming ticket. We will have recordings that will be available that you'll be able to see it there as well. So again, I want to thank all three of you for joining me here today and having a nice discussion around culture and CultureCon. And I wanted to thank you all for tuning in as well. And hopefully we will see you next week.